Hello and welcome to Revisiting Mad Men. In this episode we're going to analyse Season 1 Episode 9, which is titled Shoot, and it was written by Chris Provenzano and Matt Weiner, and it was directed by Paul Feig. The opening scene of this episode shows Betty trimming the hedge on the front lawn, and the kids are seen playing in the background with Polly the dog as well. And then they show us the neighbour who lets out his pigeons in his front lawn, and the whole family stand and watch the pigeons and the sky. And then the neighbour waves at Betty and she waves back. The next scene shows Jim Hobart bump into Don Draper. They're both at a Broadway musical. They're watching Fiorello with their wives, and they bump into each other during the intermission, and Jim Hobart basically starts selling McCann to Don Draper. He wants to hire Don, and he says stuff like, he brings up the size of McCann, basically saying stuff like, you'll have over 500 people at your disposal. Imagine what you could do with that sort of power, basically. And then Jim Hobart's wife and Betty Draper come and join in on the conversation. And then Draper and Jim Hobart's wife, whose name's Adele, they go to the bar, and then it's just Betty and Jim Hobart having a chat. And here Hobart introduces the prospect of Betty doing a Coke ad, and he gives her his card and says, be in touch if you're interested. Later on we see Francine and Betty in the kitchen. I believe this is the next day. Betty tells Francine about her interaction with Jim Hobart, and she again mentions, just as she did to Jim Hobart, she tells Francine now that she's to do some modelling. And they actually go upstairs and Betty tries on some of her old dresses for Francine. And it's important to note here that Betty has never looked happier than when she's doing this modelling for her friend here. The next we see of Betty is when she's at her therapy session, and this scene again begins with her talking about her modelling days to her therapist. And I think the reason Betty keeps bringing up her modelling days is because she's probably really proud of that part of her identity, and she probably misses that part of her identity, being the young girl in Manhattan with a modelling career. Because now as she says to her therapist, after they moved to the suburbs and she's married with kids, she suddenly felt really old. Because there's a huge contrast to being, and I don't think it's mentioned yet in Mad Men, but as we learn from later episodes, Betty was, just before she met Don, she lived with her girlfriends in an apartment, and I think they were all young aspiring models or actresses maybe. And to go from that to being what she calls herself when Hobart asks her what she does, she says, I'm a housewife. Those are like two very extremes. And then Betty goes on to talk about her mother, and she says that her mother was always very concerned about looks and weight, and she quotes her mother saying, you're going to get stout, because apparently Betty has always eaten a lot, which is funny considering her weight gain that we see later on in the show. And her therapist hears this and says to her, it sounds like you're angry at your mother. And Betty has a really strong reaction to this. She sits up out of her chair and turns around, because she's always lying down in these sessions. She sits up, and she basically is angry at her therapist for implying, or just straight up saying, that she's resentful to her mother, which she clearly is, but she doesn't accept that. And the therapist points out, well, there's a reason you're sitting up. There's a reason you reacted so strongly. It's because there clearly are some feelings there. Maybe some resentment. Later on we see Betty at home, and Don comes home from work, and she tells him that she misses her old job, and that she wants to try and do it again, and maybe that she could try this Coke ad. And then we see her go to the audition for the Coke ad, and then she books it in the later scene, and then eventually we see her actually shooting the ad, and she's got on a fake picnic with some other actors, fake kids and whatnot. And straight after that scene of her on the ad, we see her real kids, Sally and Bobby, with Polly the dog, and they're watching the neighbor's birds again, but this time Polly actually grabs one of the pigeons straight out of the air, and the neighbor says, if I see that dog in my yard again, I'll shoot it. And then the next scene is Dawn arriving at home and Betty telling Dawn about her day at work, and she says that she brought some forms home, and asks if Dawn will help her fill them out so she can get paid. And then we're shown Betty at work again, but this time, unfortunately for Betty, she's given the news that they've changed the idea for the ad, and they're now going to be shooting in London, so her ad won't be aired anymore. And she's really hurt by this. She's basically crying when she hears this. And when Don arrives home that evening, she's too vain to tell him the truth about the ad being moved, so she just says that she no longer wants to model. Maybe it's not vanity, maybe it's just embarrassing or something. But she doesn't want him to know the real reason, so she says that she just no longer wants to model. And Don says, are you sure? And she says, it's fine, yeah. I don't know what I was thinking. And then Don tells her that she's the best mother any child could have and that her dinner tastes great. And she smiles, but it's not the same smile we saw when she was trying on dresses for Francine. That smile when she was modeling for Francine looked so genuine, and I just get the sense that she really did want to do the modeling, and I think she still maybe wanted to fulfill that dream of hers. I'm not sure. That's the feeling I get. And of course this episode ends with Betty with a cigarette in her mouth shooting the neighbour's pigeons out of the sky. I have read that apparently she's not killing these birds or something like that. But I don't know anything about guns, so I can't tell what gun she's using. But apparently we're not meant to think that she's killing these birds. She's just, I don't know how you shoot a bird but not kill it, but something about the bullets, I'm not sure. Either way, she looks like a badass. It's a cool scene. But I don't know what to exactly take from it. Because of the song that's playing at the time, which is My Special Angel by Bobby Helms, and because of just her demeanor, it doesn't look like a very gloomy scene to me. She looks quite content. As I say, she looks pretty cool whilst doing it. So I don't know if we're meant to think that this is some sort of release of some built up anger or resentment or something. I don't know. Sometimes I just don't know. I don't know how to feel about something. I like it. It looks cool. It's cool in that sense, but I just don't know what to take from it, I guess. Other than maybe she's just releasing some anger. She's frustrated. She's frustrated of being a housewife, even though she, probably wants to pursue this modeling career deep down. I don't know. And we do have some stuff to talk about with regards to Peggy, which kind of links to Betty's situation here. Because let's assume that she's shooting those pigeons because she's got some frustrations about being a housewife and not pursuing her career aspirations. If we now compare that to the stuff that Peggy goes through in this episode, which is basically the second time we see Peggy. The first time we see her is she's dropping off a package to Don, but the second time we see her is when she's picking something up off from the floor and her skirt rips, because I guess she's gaining on some weight. Now, not that Peggy knows this, and obviously we as the audience don't know this at the time either, but she's not gaining on that weight because of too much lunch, as Joan says later on in the episode. She's gaining that weight because she's pregnant. Now, on the topic of Peggy's weight, let's talk about her conversation with Joan, which revolves around Peggy's weight. My feelings about this conversation are that it's meant to reflect what Betty was talking about earlier, which is the two sorts of views about, I guess, feminine identity, at least in this world, in the Sterling Cooper offices and the world that Betty lives in. Betty talks about her mum telling her about weight and women needing to be skinny and beautiful looking, basically. And Joan is saying similar things to Peggy here, where she's saying you have to lose weight she poses this question to Peggy where she says, don't you want to do well here? Because for Joan, a woman's success is inextricably linked to her personal appearance and basically how beautiful people think she is. Whereas Peggy isn't, she's not concerned about those things. Her response is to say, I'm the first woman to do any writing in this office since the war, because that's what Peggy's concerned about. She doesn't care that she's put on weight. She just wants to progress in her career. And Joan brings it back to her values when she says, is this what that's about? I thought you were doing that to get close to Paul. Again, because Joan can't fathom a woman wanting to aspire to be a copywriter or to, a woman to have those aspirations. Because Joan doesn't, not yet at least. And then Joan says to Peggy, you're hiding a very attractive young girl with too much lunch. And then Peggy says in response to this, And she's got a really empathetic smile as she says this to Joan when she says, "I just realized something. You think you're being helpful." And this line shows a level of emotional maturity that Peggy has that Betty doesn't possess. Because Betty heard very much the same things from her own mother that Joan is saying now. Yet Betty's reaction was to basically not acknowledge the emotional abuse that she got from her mother, and instead repeat those patterns as we saw in the ending of Babylon, where Betty is teaching Sally how to apply lipstick. Peggy, who's in a very similar situation here with Joan, although it's not her mother, I know, but it's a very similar idea basically. And Peggy just says, she understands basically. And she doesn't fire back with any malice to Joan. She just says that she acknowledges that Joan is trying to be helpful. But Joan's priorities are different to Peggy's, essentially. And Peggy understands that. Lastly, I want to talk about Don and his storyline that involves Jim Hobart in this episode. As I mentioned earlier, Jim Hobart started to sell McCann to Don when they bumped into each other during the intermission of the Broadway show that they were watching with their wives. And the next we see of that is Don receiving a package on his desk, and when he opens it, it's a towel and it's a note from Jim Hobart. And what Jim has done is he's bought Don a membership to the New York Athletics Club. And we don't see Don go to this place, this gym, or I guess it's more than just a gym, but we don't see him use that membership in this episode or even in this season probably. However, I feel like in season 4, episode 8, called The Summer Man, he does go swimming, and I'm not sure if they mention it in that episode or not, but I believe he's using that card that Jim Hobart bought him, which I thought was a nice touch. So Don receives this gift and he calls Jim Hobart, and we're shown Jim Hobart in his office, and the set design here reveals a lot. If I wanted to be pretentious, I'd say the mise en scène differs between Don's office and Jim Hobart's office. What we see in Jim's office are, first of all, he's got, 2 or 3 employees just around him. I'm guessing they're assistants, maybe they're secretaries, I'm not sure, but they're just around him, and I guess they're there in case he needs anything. And his office is brighter, it's more spacious, he's got modern art, sculptures in the background and all sorts. And it looks more like the whitewashed SCDP offices we see later on after that drastic change from the old offices to the new place. And I guess that's to convey what Jim Hobart was talking about earlier. McCann is just a much, much larger company. And then Jim Hobart offers Don a job, and he offers him a 3-year contract with a salary of $35,000. Which, after I put into an inflation calculator, that would be the equivalent of $303,600 in today's money. Now, I mention this quote because A, it's kind of interesting to know what Don is earning, but also because I really wonder what Don thinks of a 3-year contract. It was just, I think, last episode where we saw him begging Midge to go to Paris with him, and we don't know if he was intending to come back. We simply don't know. So to me, when I hear 3-year contract, what I think Don is thinking is, I don't know if he's going to be around, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because he seems to me like the kind of guy who has a bag packed and is ready to up and leave. Because I imagine that's how you'd have to be if you're a criminal, to the extent that Don is, where he's stolen another man's identity. He's probably just always ready to run. Eventually, Roger hears that Jim Hobart's trying to scout Don, and he goes to Don's office and he makes it known that he really values Don, and he says, "You're 1 in a million, Draper." And just as Jim Hobart did, Roger Sterling starts to sell Sterling Cooper to Don and says stuff like, "You want to start over?" Which, if I was Don, is something I would think about. I'm not sure if it's the right thing to just stay where you are because you're comfortable there, but it's certainly something that I've thought about in the past when making big life choices about whether or not to leave somewhere. And Don says he hasn't decided yet. He hasn't made up his mind. And Roger says that he's taking it all very personally, which I totally understand, if I'm being honest. Roger and Don do have a personal relationship, so he's not wrong, I don't think, for taking it personally. And almost a mirroring of scenes later on in the episode, we see Don going to Roger's office to tell him that he has made up his mind and that he sees no reason to leave. And right there and then they pour a drink and they decide what his salary is going to be, and they decide that 45 grand is appropriate. They clink their glasses and then they decide that there's also going to be no contract, which is a great detail from the writers. No contract allows Don to up and leave whenever he fucking wants, which is perfect for him. It really does put the ball in his court, and that's probably why Sterling Cooper, that is, eventually do get him on a contract, because it's kind of ridiculous to have an employee who doesn't have a contract. And then we see Don go back to his office and decline the offer from Jim Hobart via a phone call. And that's all I have to say for this week's episode. Do join me next week when we'll be discussing the 10th episode of season 1, which is titled The Long Weekend. And it's pretty crazy to me that we've already done 9 of these. It doesn't feel like I'm already nearing the end of season 1. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. I hope you join me next week. You've been listening to Revisiting Mad Men.